Okay, we'd like to welcome you to the next session. On behalf of the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies at the University of Notre Dame, I'd like to thank the organizers and the staff here who've done a wonderful job in putting together a fabulous program. We hope we can continue that trajectory. This is also we also thank the organizers for allowing us to host what we call a Keough Global Seminar here. This would be actually the second in a series that began last spring in Cluj, Romania, and we're all delighted to be here. Let me also welcome and especially welcome the speakers. The first is Professor James Chandler, who is a William B. Ogden Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, and formerly Director of the Franke Institute for the Humanities and Chair of the Department of Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Chicago. His many publications include An Archaeology of Sympathy, The Sentimental Mode in Literature and Cinema, England in 1819, The Politics of Literary Culture and the Case of Romantic Historicism, and Wordsworth's Second Nature, A Study into Poetry and Politics, and also many edited books, including, of course, with Marilyn Butler, the Cambridge Studies in Romanticism book series for the Cambridge University Press, which was begun in 1990. I think at least 85 monographs published since.
125.
120. You know, you can't trust Wikipedia. 125. Thanks for the correction. We're here for facts. Julie Kipp is the author of Romanticism, Maternity, and the Body Politic, published by the Cambridge University Press in 2003, and the former managing editor of Boulogne, an Irish Studies journal. She was professor of 19th century British literature at Hope College for many years, and former director of the Women's and Gender Studies program at Hope. She also served recently as visiting professor of literature and director of the writing program for the Westville Prison Educational Initiative at Holy Cross College in Notre Dame. We're glad they let you out.
It's where I belong.
Dr. Kipp is just completing a self-gifted sabbatical year during which he has traveled extensively and finished a monograph entitled Ireland and Romantic and Atlantic Archipelagic, Cosmopolitan Romanticism and the British Peripheries. We also have with us Claire Connolly, who is Professor of Modern English at University College Cork in Ireland, a Fellow of the Learned Society of Wales, and a member of the Royal Irish Academy. Professor Connolly's book, A Cultural History of the Irish Novel, 1790 to 1829, published in the Cambridge Studies in Romanticism, I don't know which number, won the Donald J. Murphy Prize for Distinguished First Monograph awarded by the American Conference for Irish Studies. Professor Connolly has also edited Theorizing Ireland, and with Joe Cleary, the Cambridge Companion to Modern Irish Culture. Scholarly editions include 2 volumes in the works of Mariah Edgeworth and Cindy Owenson's The Wild Irish Girl. Professor Connolly has been a visiting associate professor of Irish Studies and English at Boston College, as well as O'Brien Professor at Concordia University in Montreal. With Marjorie Howes, she is the general editor of a new 6-volume series, Irish Literature in Transition, 1700 to 2015, under contract with the Cambridge University Press, as well as editor of volume 2 of the series, entitled Irish Literature in Transition, 1780 to 1830. Professor Connolly's current book project is a book entitled Irish Romanticism for the Cambridge University Press, And we were delighted to learn recently that she will be the Parnell Fellow in Irish Studies at Magdalen College, Cambridge for 2018-2019. Professor James Chandler.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks to the Keough Center for sponsoring this panel and to the organizers for putting together this terrific conference. What can adaptation histories tell us about source texts? No novel has had as rich a history of screen adaptations as Frankenstein, and my aim here today is to see what it might reveal about our specific pair of topics for this novel, Race in Ireland. I begin, as one must, with the most influential of all adaptations, James Whale's 1931 film from Universal. It is not only the first of the Frankenstein films for Universal, the first of 8, but also the template for the nearly 6 dozen classic horror films from that studio that were made over the same period, including both the Dracula and the Wolfman series. There's a detail from the last slide, and you can see Frankenstein second in the third row. These films were dumped into American network TV in the late 50s, and I used to go to my grandmother's where I could stay up on Friday nights and watch them all. I think I saw all 72 before I read the novel in 1970. In any discussion of race in Frankenstein, it is worth reviewing exactly how Whale's film transformed the fundamental problematics of Mary Shelley's novel. The crux of the matter, as we've already heard, lies in the handling of materiality itself, an issue that is neatly indexed in Frankenstein's reaction to the moment of his creature's animation. In Whale's film, the reaction of Colin Clive's Frankenstein is famously one of celebration and triumph. It's alive, it's alive. Like much of Whale's film, including the creature's muteness, this line comes from the theatrical tradition that descends from Peake's presumption, which we'll be hearing more about tomorrow. In Shelley's novel, of course, as we've noted repeatedly in this room already, the reaction is disgust and repulsion. Likewise, in the novel, Frankenstein's rejection of his creature is pivotal for Shelley's highly equivocal handling of questions of sympathy, responsibility, justice, and indeed race. So when in the core narrative the creature appeals to Frankenstein to make him a mate on the grounds that having been turned monstrous by rejection, he deserves one, his plea gains authority by virtue of its unwitting echo, unwitting on the creature's part, of the epistolary frame in which the 18th century doctrine of moral sentiments is invoked, in effect, by Walton and Frankenstein when they discuss their own growing friendship. This is a doctrine that holds that moral fulfillment is impossible without the exchange of sympathy with others. It descends from people like Adam Smith, which we haven't much talked about yet. This is why the novel's central moral case, then, turns on the question of whether Frankenstein should or should not create a mate for his creature, and this is why the novel's central interpretive question takes the form of a teetering chiasmus. Will no one sympathize with the creature because he is a monster, or does he become a monster because no one sympathizes with him? Whale's film methodically shifts Shelley's delicate balance in interrelated ways. Colin Clive's positive response to the creature's animation in the film removes a key trigger from Shelley's plot and thus obviates her puzzle about whether the creature's monstrosity has a broadly social or crudely material cause. Whale not only follows Peake in introducing Fritz, the laboratory assistant, but he also has Fritz mismanage the brain transplant such that the creature is given a criminal brain. To put the point the other way around, materializing the cause of monstrosity in this way means that Frankenstein is free to celebrate his creature at the moment of animation, as Mel Brooks brilliantly captures with Gene Wilder's coochie-coochie-coo affection for Peter Boyle's monster in The Young Frankenstein, likewise within a broad parody of a brain-swapping narrative. It is true that in the Whale Brooks line, we sometimes see the creature in painful encounters, but the material fact of the criminal brain means that such rejection is not fundamentally causal in those narratives. And as for the question of making a mate for the creature, Whale and Brooks simply erase its very occasion. All this is relevant here because without the consideration of making the creaturely mate, the discourse of race and species is also fundamentally altered. Whale's creature lacks the wherewithal to articulate the nuanced case, of course, made by Shelley's. And this basic thematic configuration that I've just described holds for most of the sequels in the universal series of classic adaptations, with the partial exception of Whale's own brilliant sequel, Bride of Frankenstein in 1935. It's partial because while this film's prologue, you'll all recall, self-consciously announces a return to Mary Shelley's novel, the film mostly remains within the narrative framework established by its predecessor. So while Bride recovers a truncated version of the de Lacy interlude, showing the creature's rapport with a blind hermit who plays the violin, it also removes the causal force of this episode by placing it after the creature has already committed several murders, or, to respect that distinction we were making yesterday, after he's killed several people. Bride also, of course, recovers Shelley's vital plot point about the making of the bait for the creature. Yet the impetus and argument for this experiment in Bride of Frankenstein comes not from the still largely inarticulate creature himself, but from a third party, Ernst Thesiger's brilliantly witty Dr. Pretorius. And it is Pretorius, not Frankenstein, who broaches the topic of race. Whereas Shelley's Victor Frankenstein fretted about a threatened race of devils that might issue from any union of his creatures, in Bride of Frankenstein, Dr. Pretorius explicitly argues that such a union offers the hopeful chance to, quote, create a race, a man-made race upon the face of the earth. Remember, the year is 1935. In a further departure from the novel, Whale's sequel has Frankenstein actually following through with this second creation, which occasions a series of possibilities, very much like those explored so brilliantly in Debbie's film yesterday. In the event, as things play out in Bride of Frankenstein, the female creature, you may recall, rejects Boris Karloff in favor of Colin Clive, a plot development that seems to dramatize the impossibility within Quayle's bad brain paradigm of their forming a man-made race. Such then was the state of play immediately post-war and toward the end of the first phase of Hollywood's studio system, which was altered in 1948, and just before the institutionalization of television. Everything changes in the adaptations that begin to be made in the 1970s, perhaps in part because the novel itself begins to be read more widely. In most of these adaptations, even the mini-budget steampunk adaptation of 2015, we see a dramatic movement away from Whale and back to Mary Shelley's narrative concepts. The restored reference points include an articulate creature trained in language by his clandestine observation of the de Lacy family, the developed theme of creaturely sensitivity running afoul of social rejection, and the full playing out of the decision about making a mate for the creature. These changes are reflected in the restoration of Mary Shelley's onomastics. After 1970, Frankenstein tends to be called Victor, as in the novel, rather than Henry, as in the Whale films. And minor characters like Clerval, Felix de Lacy, William and Justine tend to be restored. Some recent adaptations, most notably the Kenneth Branagh one from 1994 with De Niro as the creature, also include the Walton frame. Here's the steampunk version of the recovery of Victor by Walton. You see, it's not the Arctic. I said it was a mini-budget production this evening. I'm going to come back to Walton in my conclusion. Two adaptations made for television in 1973, one American and one British, set the terms for the new paradigm. In the American version, we have a creature who learns enough language from the de Lacys to appeal to Victor in persuasive terms, and we also have a full following through with the plot to make the creature's female mate. And with the reintroduction of this major plot line from the novel comes a strong new inflection that was already hinted at in the Bride of Frankenstein, that the story will be less about playing God and more about playing Hitler. An early conversation between Victor and his assistant sets the new tone as they make explicit that what they seek to create is a superhuman. The very look of the creature, in this case played by Bo Svensson, suggests something of the Aryan type. Here's a closer look. And the same goes for the mate that Victor nearly complains in this film. This is a bad image, I apologize. Also very Aryan. The British adaptation from the same year, interestingly scripted by Christopher Isherwood, is far more flamboyant than its American counterpart, and it boasts a cast, amazingly, that includes James Mason, Rafe Richardson, and John Gielgud. It also returns to Mary Shelley's race theme in an explicitly eugenicist register. Indeed, Michael Sarrazin's creature is beautiful and flawless just after reanimation, fulfilling, who was it, Brad's question from yesterday. And his creature calls him more than a man, the first of a new race. The wrinkle here, literally, is that the perfect creature degenerates over time, thus gradually rejoining the ranks of other screen incarnations of Shelley's hideous progeny. The creation of the mate is urged, in this case on Frankenstein, by a new Pretorius, called Dr. Polidori, interestingly, played by Svengalian James Mason, calling her the first of her species after she comes into being. Mason's Polidori teaches her the ways of society in a nice twist by having her emulate Frankenstein's fiancée, Elizabeth. In his 1994 big-budget film, Branagh also restores additional parts of the novel neglected or subverted by Whale, especially in the handling of the Walton frame and the de Lacy interlude, but with two noteworthy changes. One is that Victor is above all driven by medical considerations because of his witnessing of the death of his mother and giving birth to William, and the other is that he perversely makes the female creature from the dead body of his wife Elizabeth after the creature has murdered her. This unfolds in a reversal of a Devi-like variation that was played first in Whale's Bride of Frankenstein. For in Branagh's film, the female creature rejects Victor, played by Branagh himself, in favor of De Niro's creature. I know, who among us wouldn't choose De Niro? In rejecting the classic cinematic standing of Whale's films, these post-1970 adaptations also tend to highlight those aspects of Mary Shelley's text that dramatize issues of race in a particular register. They turn in particular on an exponential logic of species reproduction that Shelley would have known closely from the work of her father's great intellectual adversary and one of her husband's bête noire, Thomas Malthus. There are also issues that Shelley highlights by introducing as the very first text in the creature's education, Volney's Ruins of Empire, with its enlightened and cosmopolitan presentation of the question of race. Volney's Republican avatar in this text, the genius of tombs and ruins, offers a kind of global panorama and a set of reflections meant to explode prejudice the world over as it takes in, quote, the numerous castes of Indians, the vast empire of the Chinese, the sable race of Africa, the islanders of the ocean, and the tribes of America. Alan Coffey touched on this text in its role in the novel yesterday. So now I just want to ask you to hold this thought as I turn to the question of Ireland, using another recent adaptation to do so. The most assiduous reinstatement of Shelley's novel that I've seen is the 2003 American-German collaboration, a television miniseries that boasts an oddly realist mise-en-scène with high production values and, again, an impressive cast, which includes Donald Sutherland, Julie Delpy, William Hurt, and Jean Rochefort. Its present tense action is the encounter on Walton's ship in the Arctic ice, Donald Sutherland is Walton, with a series of extended flashbacks matched to Victor's narration in impressive granularity. The film details the young Frankenstein's early life in Geneva. It offers a full picture of his studies in Ingolstadt. Those are often collapsed in the earlier adaptations. It provides some close observation of the creature's first months in the world, including his learning to speak, to read, and to feel emotion through his observation of the de Lacy family. Thank you. Now I have to kind of balance here. Hold on. So here you see him, this quite beautiful monster in this much closer to the 19th century Frankenstein peering through the chink in the shed. And this adaptation speaks directly to questions of race and reproduction, not least in staging Victor's decision to renege on his promise as a direct response to the creature's lover-like effusions over the unfinished body of his mate, effusions in which the creature speaks specifically of the offspring he intends to produce with her. I hope you can sort of see that, see the body on the bottom shining, and there's the creature above. It's not a very good image, I'm sorry. Uniquely, among the adaptations I've seen, moreover, this one attempts quite carefully to narrate the events of Shelley's story between the destruction of the mate and the creature's threatened murder of Elizabeth on her wedding night. Namely, Victor's disposal of the female creature's corpse from a small boat. These aren't going to be good images. That's the corpse in the light there. You can barely see Victor, I'm sorry. His confrontation with a crowd of villagers. There are the villagers again. And his arrest by a local magistrate. His viewing of the body of the murdered Clerval. That's played by the same guy who gets killed at the end of the third season of Downton Abbey. Dan, what's his name? Dan something. And his being released from jail by the good offices of his father. That detail is there too. Can you barely make out the father and Victor and the magistrate. I think we can have the lights again, please. In every other adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that I've seen, including post-70, these events are constantly elided, and they are, of course, exactly the events that constitute the Irish episode in the novel. But even in this hyper-faithful 2003 adaptation, to come to my point, the events in question are not set in Ireland. All the images that I've just shown you are images in which the scene is meant to be not Ireland, but a small lake near Ingolstadt. The villagers and the police are meant to be German locals, as is the magistrate, even though, weirdly, he is named in the cast of characters as Kerwin, the Irish magistrate in Shelley's text. A Galway name, so it gives you a sense that where he lands in Ireland is actually Galway. Roughly 500 miles from the remotest island of the Orkneys, which he's supposed to cover in 3 days of drifting in the novel, which is another reason I think why they might have steered away from trying to manage the logistics of the Irish episode. Okay, given her Irish grandmother and the involvement of her father and husband in Dublin, there are many ways to motivate Shelley's interest in Ireland, an interest to which she returns, of course, in the invasion sequence from The Last Man. And I suspect we're going to hear more about that in Claire's and Julie's papers, but my query here is specifically this. Can the question of what to make of the Irish episode in Frankenstein also be tied to the question of why it never seems to figure in any of the novel's myriad adaptations? Not even in this, its most assiduously faithful one, directed, as it happens, by an Englishman of Irish descent, Kevin Connor. So, to see how this is so, I want to suggest in my 2 minutes remaining that one feature that's common to all of the adaptations, pre-48 and post-70, is a certain provincial insularity. When you go back and look at the first 2 whale films, as I did after screening all of these dozen other films, you find that the psychological and moral allegories implicit in those films tended to be acted out in what I want to call the pathos of local village life, in spectacles of regional mores and customs. In the settings of these films, the wedding of Victor Frankenstein is the scene or local festival in which the villager carries the dead body of the girl in the first Frankenstein. In the settings of these films, much as in the Transylvania of Hollywood's Dracula and Wolfman adaptations, local ethnic color thoroughly trumps global race theory of the sort developed by, say, Volney. The recurrent parochialism of this mise-en-scène throughout the adaptation tradition is deeply at odds, I want to say, with Mary Shelley's aspirations to produce a cosmopolitan frame for her narrative. Those aspirations surface with key reference points in her text, with the Safi backstory and the treachery of the Turk, with Clerval's interest in the affairs of the East India Company, and with the creature's promise to take his mate and their brood to the remotest reaches of South America. Yet these reference points almost never appear in the adaptation tradition, early or late, not even in those that declare their allegiance to Shelley's own novel. The frame narrative of Walton's Arctic expedition is perhaps the most insistent signal in the novel of these globalizing aspirations. Yet even when this frame is restored in certain recent adaptations, the Walton frame, the globalizing impulses of the source text are strangely muted. Likewise, that part of the novel that takes the duo of Frankenstein and his creature to Scotland and, for the strangest of interludes, to Ireland, seems to be part of Mary Shelley's effort to widen out the core narrative of her novel towards the widest possible horizon of its field of action, if not to remotest India or South America or Turkey, at least to the semi-colonial periphery of Celtic Europe. I'll show you this last image, which is a kind of a fake out on my part. This is Michael Sarracen's now degenerated creature pointing to Ireland on the map, but this is a frame enlargement that I made, a still, from a sequence that actually has the creature following his finger up to the North Pole. He actually goes right by Ireland on the map. So in this way, I'm suggesting Shelley sought to internationalize both the novel's action and its implication. One feature of the whale paradigm from which the adaptation tradition never frees itself, in other words, is a commitment to a certain pop folklorist tendency. And this flattened ethnic provinciality remains stubbornly blind to the global ambitions of a novel that is itself so ambivalent about the very question of global ambition. Thank you.
Trapped in a small boat off the coast of western Scotland, Victor Frankenstein lands in Ireland because a storm catches him unawares and defenseless. His sojourn in Ulster repeats that motif as he is mistakenly arrested for the murder of his closest friend, finds himself imprisoned, and then is laid low for months by an illness that renders him all but senseless. Ireland proves to be an incredibly hostile locale, where Victor becomes victim. Although throughout the bulk of the narrative, his solipsistic behavior tends to infuriate readers, the novel's Irish episode might actually inspire our sympathies for Victor. Ireland is a site of violence and special cruelty in Frankenstein, a place where justice is long delayed, though in the end, Victor does find an Irish advocate, and he is eventually vindicated and freed. These themes should resonate powerfully with any reader familiar with the history of the Irish, who witnessed a tremendous amount of violence during the Romantic period, but little actual economic or political justice. It is therefore curious that to date, Mary Shelley scholars haven't shown much interest in Victor's experience of Ireland, an island, quote, renowned for its hospitality, though in the end, for Victor, quote, the scene of so much misery. Susan Krogh, one exception to this rule, points to the Irish scenes as representative of Mary Shelley's, quote, revolutionary anxieties, and connects the episode to Shelley's broader critique of the violence she associated with revolutionary France, following numerous critics in seeing Victor Frankenstein's creature as an allegory of the French Revolution, something born out of the highest ideals, but improperly tended and spun out of control. Anne Malore stresses, in similar vein, that Shelley advocates in the novel for gradual political change, and rejects outright revolutionary means, what Malord terms Promethean politics, as the path to regenerative transformation. Violent revolution seems to be, for Shelley, the inevitable and tragic result of the neglect of leaders to nurture and tend to the energies they, like Victor Frankenstein, helped to create. Mary Shelley's fears about the potential monstrosity of political radicalism are recorded in an oft-cited passage in Frankenstein, which Anne referred to yesterday, when Victor, reflecting back on his own mistakes, muses that, quote, a human being in perfection ought always to preserve a calm and peaceful mind, unquote. For, quote, if no man allowed any pursuit whatsoever to interfere with the tranquility of his domestic affections, Greece had not been enslaved, Caesar would have spared his country, America would have been discovered more gradually, and the empires of Mexico and Peru had not been destroyed. Ireland might well have been one of the sites cataloged here. A nation even closer to home than France that demonstrated the kind of revolutionary dynamics she critiqued in Frankenstein. Romantic Ireland would seem to provide Mary Shelley with another, even more recent case of bloody rebellion, something good turned bad. Yet the story of revolt in Ireland was in many ways also quite distinct from that of France. In Ireland, there were, of course, no guillotines, no imperialist aspirations, no military leaders turned dictator tyrants, just young and old men and some women with largely good intentions, mostly killed in battle and from their wounds, or hunted down and executed, often in truly brutal fashion. These rebels were poets and enlightened political theorists who advocated eloquently for long overdue justice, not only for themselves, but for others who were disenfranchised in Ireland. They didn't resemble Victor Frankenstein as much as they did Henry Clerval, his friend, who was killed in Ireland like them. Their story held great potential to seduce young idealists in England, such as Mary's partner and later her husband from December 30th, 1816, Percy Bysshe Shelley. Percy had in fact chosen Ireland in 1812 as the site of his first public address and only sustained political campaign. And while most Shelley scholars dismiss this episode in the young P.B. Shelley's life, more recently a number of scholars have argued persuasively for the seriousness of his endeavor. Some of his efforts to cultivate connections in Dublin were clearly rebuffed. Yet while in Ireland, he did befriend radicals, distribute pamphlets, deliver a well-received speech at a meeting of the Catholic Committee at which Daniel O'Connell was the headline event, and attract enough attention to be mentioned in a spy's report to the Home Secretary. It's difficult to believe that this wasn't an episode in Percy's life that didn't significantly influence Mary's views on Ireland. And Percy wasn't Mary's only close family member interested in radical Irish politics. William Godwin also had many ties to radicals in and outside of Ireland, and Mary Wollstonecraft had strong claims on Ireland and Irish radicals as well. Even the most cursory look at the Shelley Circle's interest in Romantic-era Ireland reveals the substantial engagements of Mary's nearest and dearest with Irish radicals and radicalism. In the remainder of this paper, I will briefly account for some of those relationships in order to provide some much-needed critical background context for the Irish episode in Frankenstein. I hope to highlight the powerful connections linking English and Irish radicals during the Romantic period, and to add some nuance to our current thinking about Mary Shelley's relationship with radicalism by considering briefly her relationship with Ireland. We know that she was reading a lot of Irish literature during the autumn of 1816, when she was working furiously on the first draft of Frankenstein. And she was certainly positioned to feel sympathy for the Irish cause. She was of Irish descent herself on her mother's side, and would have understood better than most the nature of suffering in Ireland. The Ireland she depicts in her novel seems to be a place where hopes and dreams are murdered, victors as well as his creatures. Yet it is also a place where the all but dead Victor is rescued. He is restored to his father, in Ireland and finds a real friend, unlike his creature. In Ireland, Victor experiences a revolution of sorts, a small one, however, which unfortunately doesn't last. In Ireland, the tale played out in essence the same. Inspired by the political philosophy underwriting the revolutions in America and especially France, in the 1790s, Anglicans, Presbyterians, and Catholics in Ireland joined forces in a conspiracy to separate from the British, restore economic and political rights to disenfranchised Catholics, and establish a republic built on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The rebellion in 1798 these United Irishmen led, with a bit of support from the French, was crushed in a matter of months, however. Shortly thereafter, Ireland was brought into the Union, technically in 1801, but another rebellion followed quickly in 1803, led by surviving United Irish leaders Robert Emmet and Thomas Russell, both of whom in the aftermath were hung and then beheaded. Romanticists tend to remember the United Irishmen principally for their role in the 1798 rebellion in Ireland, as national martyrs or possibly as political terrorists, that is, if we remember them at all. But we don't necessarily think first about their broader modernizing agenda, the United Irish leaders' prominent roles in the anti-slavery movement in Ireland, for example, which is mostly an untold story. Above all, these freedom fighters were children of the Scottish Enlightenment, schooled up on the principles of Francis Hutcheson and Adam Smith. Francis Hutcheson, himself an Ulsterman and a proponent of unity amidst diversity. Kevin Whelan stresses that, quote, rather than seeing religious, ethnic, and political diversity as a distinct problem, the United Irishmen saw it as a glorious opportunity to construct a wider, more tolerant, and generous version of Irish identity. It's hardly surprising that Percy Shelley, the visionary and dreamer, was drawn to their forward-leaning platform. Not unlike Mary Wollstonecraft, who had utilized contemporary debates about civil rights and tyrannical forms of government as a springboard for exploring a more expansive definition of citizenship. These Romantic-era Irish patriots were all about challenging identity models grounded in essentialist paradigms, and they supported a broad progressive agenda. Many in the United Irish camp, in fact, openly admired Wollstonecraft's writings, some of which had been reprinted in the radical Belfast newspaper, the Northern Star. Martha McTeer, for example, wrote repeatedly to her brother, the United Irish leader William Drennan, about Wollstonecraft's work. In one case holding that Wollstonecraft, quote, conspires to make an important change. I wish they would order her book to be burned. Drennan's responses indicated that he had also read A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and in turn he recommended to Martha William Godwin's memoir of Wollstonecraft, as well as Wollstonecraft's letters written during a short residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. Archibald Hamilton Rowan, a founding member of the Dublin Society of United Irishmen and the principal United Irish liaison to Scotland, one of the most important players in radical Irish politics of the period, was actually a close friend of Wollstonecraft's. A feminist himself by most modern definitions, Rowan was an advocate for the poor as well as for women's rights long before he became involved in radical Irish politics or met Wollstonecraft, which happened while they were both living in France, after he had escaped prison in Ireland, having been convicted of sedition. After they were introduced at a party in Paris in the spring of 1795, they became fast friends and eventual long-term correspondents. Wollstonecraft, in fact, aided and abetted Rowan's escape by providing him a place of refuge. He occupied her cottage at Le Havre in the spring of 1795, while he was awaiting passage to America, and she was in transit on her return to London. William Godwin included in his memoirs of the author of The Vindication of the Rights of Women a footnote which highlighted his late wife's deep admiration of and affection for the United Irish leader, and I quote, a person from whose society at this time Mary derived particular gratification was Archibald Hamilton Rowan, who had lately become a fugitive from Ireland in consequence of political prosecution, and in whom she found those qualities which were always eminently engaging to her: great integrity of disposition and great kindness of the heart. Wollstonecraft would have known a fair amount about politics in Ireland before meeting Rowan, and certainly would have taken an active interest in his role as an agent of revolution there. Note that the year of their meeting, she brought out her historical and moral view of the origin and progress of the French Revolution and the effect it has produced in Europe. Moreover, her knowledge of Irish politics was largely gleaned firsthand. She had lived in Ireland herself in 1786 and 87, working as a governess for an influential Anglo-Irish family, the Kingsboroughs. And as it happened, Lady Kingsborough, Caroline King, was first cousin to Lord Edward Fitzgerald, one of the principal players in the '98 rebellion. Wollstonecraft had other close friends and family in Ireland as well. Her mother was Irish, as was her close friend, Fanny Blood's husband, Hugh Skies, who was a Dublin merchant, who returned to Dublin after Fanny's death. In a letter to Skies dated October 17, 1797, just 5 weeks after Wollstonecraft's death, and 7 months before the outbreak of the 1798 rebellion, William Godwin expressed his serious concern that Ireland would never find a champion in England as, quote, a great part of the English public are, at present, in a state of political apathy and torpor. The rest, he laments, are distracted by events on the continent and, quote, cannot be prevailed on to consider what is passing on the comparatively inconsiderable stage of Ireland. Godwin visited Ireland for 6 weeks in the aftermath of the rebellion in 1800, the year the Act of Union was passed. Mary Shelley shares in her additions to his memoirs that he resided there principally with the famous lawyer John Philpot Curran, who had in fact represented Archibald Hamilton Rowan in 1794 during his trial for sedition. Curran also had famously provided the defense for William Drennan, who was in the end acquitted of his sedition charges. He was also the father of Sarah Curran, the fiancée of Robert Emmet, the leader, one of the leaders of the 1803 rebellion, and Amelia Curran, who became quite close to Mary a few years later while she and Percy were living in Italy, and who famously painted Percy's portrait. Mary relates in her additions to Godwin's memoirs that while in Ireland, besides Curran, her father associated with Henry Grattan and all the illustrious Irish patriots. Unquote. Within days of returning to England from exile in America in 1803, Archibald Hamilton Rowan called on Godwin. They had only met once before, but from this point they very quickly became intimate friends who saw a great deal of one another. Rowan knew Godwin's children and his stepdaughter, Fanny Imlay, who he had met before as a babe in Wollstonecraft's arms. He met Mary Godwin, later Shelley, for the first time when she was 5. Rowan was impressed by Godwin's educational lab and in fact took special interest in his experiments with his children. After his personal fortune in Ireland was restored, he made Godwin a present of £450 to support that work. Almost a decade later, in early February 1812, after arriving in Dublin, accompanied by his first wife, Harriet Westbrook Shelley, and armed with a letter of introduction, Godwin's young political disciple, Percy Shelley, attempted to contact Rowan as well. As far as we know, Rowan didn't respond, though it's unclear why, and there's some speculation surrounding the matter. Shelley seems to have had a bit of a lifelong fascination with United Irishmen, in part fed by his childhood friendship with a neighbor, Emily Beauclerk, who was the half-sister of Lord Edward Fitzgerald, whom I already mentioned as one of the principal actors in the '98 rebellion. Shelley was also, like many, drawn to the tragic history of Robert Emmet and wrote several verses in Emmet's honor. Shelley appears to have prepared seriously for the trip to Ireland. He spent a number of months studying Irish history and brought along 1,500 copies of a self-authored pamphlet, An Address to the Irish People, as well as a list of radical contacts given to him by Godwin. In the address, he argues that, quote, the rational means of remedy for what's gone wrong in Ireland is, quote, Catholic emancipation and a repeal of the Union Act, the latter being the most successful engine that England ever wielded over the misery of fallen Ireland, unquote. For Shelley, the case of Ireland transcended specifically Irish interests. Quote, I am not an Irishman, the address begins, yet I can feel for you. Those are my brothers and my countrymen who are unfortunate. Opening his argument with strong claims that even as an Englishman, he could prove a friend to Ireland, who didn't just imagine the suffering there, but shared it, Percy aligns himself in the address with the universalizing vision of the United Irishmen. But he also distances himself from their unfortunate legacy, urging the Irish people to whom the address is targeted, quote, in no case to employ violence, as, quote, the way to liberty and happiness is never to transgress the rules of virtue and justice, unquote. He concludes by insisting that his aim is to break the cycle of revenge that often follows in the wake of injustice, in a passage that should have particular resonance for any reader of Frankenstein, or for that matter, of Wollstonecraft's historical and moral view of the origin and progress of the French Revolution, where she argues that in France, the rich and poor were divided into, quote, bands of tyrants and slaves, and the retaliation of slaves is always terrible, unquote. And now the quote from Percy Shelley. For can burdens be borne forever, and the slave couch and cringe the while? Is misery and vice so consonant to man's nature that he will hug it to his heart? But when the wretched one in bondage beholds the emancipator near, will he not endure his misery a while with hope and patience, then spring to his preserver's arms and start into a man, unquote. Many of us would recognize in his argument the seed of the vision that he would realize more completely in Prometheus Unbound. But Percy and Harriet returned to England after 3 months, thoroughly disillusioned with their experience in Ireland. Writing soon afterward about those experiences in a letter to a friend, Elizabeth Hitchener, he complained that in Ireland, quote, one class was bigoted, another lost in petty party aims, another blankly apathetic, and only in the remnant of the United Irishmen did one find spirits who seemed capable of being anything but merely oppositionist or ministerial, unquote. Only among those participants in and sympathizers with the rebellions of 1798 and 1803 did Shelley claim to find kindred spirits. Those rebel remnants included Roger O'Connor, the brother of Arthur, proprietor of the United Irish newspaper, The Press, John Lawless, a member of the Catholic Association and an associate of Daniel O'Connell, and Catherine Nugent, a participant of the rebellion of 1798, who is probably the most important contact for the Shelleys. She and Harriet Shelley continue to correspond for the remainder of Harriet's life. I wish I had more time to elaborate on these engagements of members of the Shelley Circle with the Irish cause, but hopefully this brief bit of background is enough to support my claim that Victor's experiences in Ireland are highly suggestive and no accident. His passage from Scotland, this challenges what Jim says a little bit, but his passage from Scotland to the north of Ireland actually mimics the pattern of the Ulster settlements, which were led by Scots Presbyterians, whose descendants became the leaders of the Belfast Society of United Irishmen. More telling still is the fact that Victor's Irish advocate, Mr. Kirwan, seems to have been modeled on a well-known Irish radical named Richard Kirwan, a famous chemist and later president of the Royal Academy, who is also rumored to be United Irishmen. Kirwan was part of the circle Godwin and other English radicals moved in, and he was also a friend of Archibald Hamilton Rowan's. Mary Shelley is clearly using the name intentionally, and in her character Kerwin, we find perhaps the only example of completely disinterested benevolence in her novel. Surely a significant detail in a most significant chapter of Victor's ordeal. In Ireland, his strength is tested, as in no other setting. He loses his closest friend and personal hero, his health and his hope. In Mary Shelley's 1831 revisions to the text, she underscores that he, quote, was a shattered wreck, the shadow of a human being. Victor is completely emaciated at the end of his stay in Ireland, almost physically grotesque. Quote, "My strength was gone. I was a mere skeleton, and fever night and day preyed upon my wasted frame," unquote. I would argue that at this moment, while in Ireland, Victor is in fact most like his creation, a shade rather than someone with a claim to full personhood. In this sense, he is also not unlike many Romantic era representations of the impoverished, often starving, disenfranchised Irish. I'd argue that the Irish episode in Frankenstein captures in miniature the suffering, the high ideals, and the wasted opportunities characterizing Ireland in the age of revolutions. By my mind, it is also a window on the sympathy, but also the ambivalence Mary Shelley must have felt about her loved ones' supportive engagements with Irish radicalism, particularly about Percy's time in Ireland. An experience which had been the expression of his most ardent idealism, the one that perhaps felt personally as well as politically threatening to Mary, given that he had shared it with Harriet, whose death in late November, early December of 1816 also haunts this period of Mary's novel's composition.
Great, thank you. Thanks, and thanks to everyone at Notre Dame for the invitation. So I'm starting from the assumption that when northeasterly winds carry Victor Frankenstein from the Orkneys to the coast of Ireland, Mary Shelley asked readers to imagine an archipelagic geography comprised of islands joined by sea, buffeted by winds, and subject to weather conditions at once violent, fickle, and deeply patterned. What kind of cultural connections flow along those same routes, I'm asking. Shelley's novel, you'll recall, sends Victor Frankenstein on a journey often through water along the Rhine, crossing from Rotterdam to London on a shipping route, avoiding the high road to Edinburgh, instead travelling by the lakes, by the Peak District, northwards to the Orkneys before the journey to Ireland, which is often described as kind of skirting the wide Atlantic, which is the threat and the immensity that Victor Frankenstein features. When he finally is freed from prison and returns, it's on a packet ship via the port of Holyhead, which was kind of really coming into its own in this period. But again, instead of following the expected route, the kind of high road, if you like, through to London, he sort of skirts southwest and goes to Le Havre via Portsmouth. So the kind of Britain's emerging infrastructure state with its legal and judicial aspects is kind of always present then in the novel, but Percy Shelley is kind of Victor Frankenstein is moving in and around the edges of it. Think following natural paths often marked by bodies of water, and we could think here of the relationship between sea crossings and the supernatural in Bram Stoker's Dracula as well, of course. So I'm asking, what about the different scales on which the novel measures these journeys by sea? The kind of arrowy swiftness that carries the monster off in Victor's sight, speed and ease, or the immeasurable waters that threaten Victor Frankenstein as he crosses at the edge of the squally Atlantic. The journals and the letters of the Shelley Circle often refer to the trials of journeys by sea, seasickness, difficult weather and so on, but the novel itself is more like in a mode of adventure or dream often, especially in these Irish scenes where Victor is laudanum induced or between waking and sleep and so on. And perhaps this is all of a piece with what we know are often the kind of utopian aspects of the imagination of Ireland within the imagination of Mary Shelley, and especially Percy Shelley. His plans in 1814 to establish a kind of utopian community in the west of Ireland, a bit like Michel Houellebecq's novel, in fact, where an alternative form of community could be imagined. So I'm thinking about a kind of romanticism of the islands, I suppose, and especially the ways in which so many of the major British Romantic writers had engagements with Ireland, not least, as Julie mentioned, Mary Wollstonecraft's time as a governess in Mitchelstown, County Cork, and in Ireland, Percy Shelley's periods in Dublin. But just to address you to one more closer to home with Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein would be to look at perhaps John Keats's journey in July of 1818, just when the reviews of Frankenstein are starting to appear. Keats crossed from Scotland to Portpatrick on a planned visit to the Giant's Causeway, eventually turned back, didn't get as far as the Giant's Causeway, not least because of the difficulty of crossing this rocky island terrain that Victor Frankenstein and the monster navigate with such ease. Keats interested himself in marginal Irish lives and the impoverishment and immiseration of Irish society, and gives us this memorable description of an old woman met on the road, being carried. Imagine, he says, the worst dog kennel you ever saw, placed upon 2 poles from a mouldy fencing. In such a thing sat a squalid old woman, squat like an ape, half starved from a scarcity of biscuit on its passage from Madagascar to the Cape, with a pipe in her mouth and looking out with a round-eyed, skinny-lidded inanity. With a sort of horizontal movement of her head, squab and lean she sat and puffed out the smoke, while 2 tattered girls carried her along. What a thing would be a history of her life and sensations. The woman's skinny-lidded eyes and the empty skull, the racialized proximity of animal and human lives. We could already be in the Ethnographic Museum with Cuvier dissecting the Hottentot Venus like we talked about yesterday. But we're also in the present-day world of the north of Ireland that Keats is visiting, where he remarks that everything costs as much in the north of Ireland as it does in Covent Garden, where he discovers that Irish miles are measured on a different scale to English ones, and so the journey is costing more, taking longer than expected, and where we're encountering not just a kind of racialized specimen, but also the kind of crowds of populous, miserable poor that characterize the landscape that he's encountering. So to imagine this kind of romanticism of the islands, we have to think about these kind of difficulties of travel, the populousness of the landscapes, and again the prevailing southwesterly winds that join the 2 islands as well. And so when Victor Frankenstein is finally kind of blown into the north coast of Ireland, he's pursued by kind of lines of connection that track murder, death, imprisonment, and rock that take him from the barren rock of the Orkneys. Has to leave his laboratory behind. He originally goes out in the skiff, if you remember, to take the remains of his laboratory, weighted down the proto-female creature, weighed down by stones, to drop it in the sea, only to be sort of carried away by sea before seeing the monster shooting off with the arrowy swiftness. He spies a high line of land towards the south, the indented shape of the coastline and the presence of high ground alerting us first in the novel to the wild and rocky place with which these sequences take place. Some traces of civilization he finds there, people speaking English. And the scenes are often read, as Julie has also mentioned, in terms of a relationship to revolutionary violence, and especially the Irish Revolution of 1798, an occluded representation of the 1798 rebellion, suggests Jarlath Killeen. It seems to me, though, that the scenes are more to do with the British state, the operations of justice, the prison system, trials and so on in this novel that is so concerned with the questions of law and how trials operate and the difference between trials and justice, and maybe the emerging sense in this period that it is within the genre of the novel that justice is to be found rather than in one or another kind of legislation. Caleb Williams, of course, in Godwin's novel, decides to bend his course to a seaport in the north of Ireland, on the west of Ireland, before we're told in the novel that Ireland has to him the disadvantage of being a dependency of the British government, and therefore a place of less security than most others that are divided from Britain by an ocean. The prison scenes in the north of Ireland, I think, really for me call up Burke's observations in the inquiry on the sublime and the beautiful into the particular forms of aesthetic duration experience when feelings of terror and surprise continue beyond their original cause. So when the threat of pain is gone, or that the danger is past, but yet the sensations continue. To explain what he means in the inquiry, Burke gives us a quotation from Homer, as he says, "When some wretch who, conscious of his crime, pursued for murder from his native clime, just gained some frontier, breathless, pale, amazed, all gaze, all wonder." And these kind of Burkean continuities extend to the feelings of guilt and shame that Victor experiences, while in fact not having committed the murder of which he is accused, and the state of confusion in these scenes of the novel, his ongoing sense of horrified imprisonment despite being in the care of the kindly magistrate, Kerwin. And I think these issues of kind of the duration, or the almost improper duration of experience, it might be possible to relate them to some of the kind of improbabilities of scale and distance in the novel. It's already been mentioned that there's this 500-mile journey from the Orkneys to the north of Ireland, crossing incredibly waters that are still considered extremely difficult to navigate, battling prevailing winds. And the other thing that happens is when he goes from the prison to the kind of county town, as it's described, the assizes, he's described as travelling 100 miles. Now, there's no Irish county where one town is 100 miles from the edge of the county, and that is particularly true of the north coast counties of Ireland, or any of the coastal counties, really. So these kind of improbabilities of space seem to map onto this kind of improper duration of experience. While at the same time always existing in a relationship to kind of known places and verifiable geographies. So when he goes to Holyhead, for example, it's to revisit a place through which Percy Shelley had passed at least 4 times on his journeys to and from Ireland. Now, the question of Ireland in relation to Frankenstein, which we're all addressing in various ways here, was, to my knowledge, first raised in a review of the novel that appeared in June of 1818, and that's John Wilson Croker's review in the Quarterly. A review that makes oddly specific reference to the Irish scenes. I've always been really interested in this review, so I'm delighted to have an opportunity to talk about it. I won't detain you on it too long, but Croker, one of the most eminent literary critics of the day, as well as a significant cultural politician and a civil servant, an agent of the British state in ways as well. Famously may have killed Keats with his review of Endymion. Addresses what Nancy Armstrong calls the often fantastic landscape of Frankenstein, with a particular feel for real places and verifiable topography. And in the review, is just, he says, Victor Frankenstein, a Swiss student, meets his Prometheus in the valley of Chamonix. He continues to specify all of the places all of the time. And he's particularly derisive of the kind of fanciful fiction of the enlightened de Lacy cottage. He says, this credible course of study and its very natural success, and brought about by a combination of circumstances almost as natural, in the aforesaid cottage, a young Frenchman employed his time in teaching an Arabian girl all of these fine things, and he goes on. And there's all of these kind of mocking references to credibility and nature, and the way in which places seem to kind of pin down these claims to verifiability. It's a discourse that makes the novel monstrous, Croker suggests. And he's kind of implying in the review that novels in general in this period are already becoming absurd with their ideas of conjoining cultures separated by time and space. Croker refers to, and I quote, the Greco-Anglico-Germanico-Gallico-Arabic library of a Swabian hut, which gives the creature his education. And not just criticising Shelley, I think, but also the kind of wider ambitions of novels, especially I would say Irish ones from 1800 onwards, to imagine local and national cultures in forms of relationship to one another and in ways that might allow alternative depictions of British society and politics, just the kinds of thing Jim is saying the adaptations don't pick up on. And so when he goes on in the review, he particularly points out the names. He says, taken up by a constable called Daniel Nugent, carried before Squire Kerwin, we're greatly edified with the laudable minuteness which induces the author to give us the names of these officers of justice. So, in other words, why these names? Why pick these names? And it may be, of course, that he knows of Richard Kerwin, that he knows of Percy Shelley's friend, Dublin friend, Catherine Nugent, and that he's noticing these names. The readers will be glad to hear that Victor is honourably quitted at the assizes of Donegal. Now, you'll all know as well as I do that Donegal is not mentioned in the text of Frankenstein. There is rather just the north coast of Ireland. Did John Wilson Croker know that Mary Wollstonecraft's mother was born in Ballyshannon, County Donegal? Does he read aspects of the geography in ways that allows him to make these identifications? Or is he continuing simply to mock the novel's claim to specificity with these unlikely references? In any case, he's translating the novel's geographical coordinates into historical terms, with these kind of scalar terms as well, the laudable minuteness of Shelley's work. Just to say a few more things about Croker, because I'm conscious of time. He's by no means kind of simply a conservative figure, although he stood for the Conservative Party, and he's often credited for giving the Conservatives the name Conservative. But for example, his 1818 proposals, when he wasn't reviewing Frankenstein, he was putting together the plan for what was eventually to become the Ordnance Survey of Ireland. He was working on the Elgin Marble acquisition. He was influencing government to vote for a grant for the completion of funding for Babbage's computing machine. So he's in no way simply, he's also campaigning for the metric system to be introduced into Britain. So he's in no way kind of anti-technocrat or anything like that. But it's possible he's seeing here a kind of a thread of connection to an emerging discourse of Irish fiction and disliking it and kind of naming it and calling it out. And we know, as Julie also mentioned, that Mary Shelley's reading, 1816, 1817, was to include Edgeworth, Maturin, Sidney Owenson, and so on. Now, the kind of more familiar way of talking about the Irish Frankenstein, as I turn away from Croker's review and towards my conclusion, is to notice the way in which the term Frankenstein, a Frankenstein, was to get taken up in Irish discourse. And we're probably all familiar with these kind of racialized Victorian depictions of the Irish Frankenstein to describe Fenianism and so on. And Marilyn Butler, of course, has written very well about the discourse of a populace stirring into life and the way that was to become represented by people like Elizabeth Gaskell and so on. In Shelley's own moment, very close to her own moment, we can see how Irish writers like Thomas More in particular pick up on the idea of Frankenstein as monster to talk about British legislation for Ireland, building perhaps on an earlier discourse of Anglo-Irish politics in terms of vampirism, the Anglo-Irish sucking the good out of the country. More in particular talks about the Act of Union as like Frankenstein's ghastly patchwork made up of contributions from the whole charnel house of political corruption. And in Carleton's novel, The Emigrants of Ahadara from 1848, you have a very specific reference, which I won't go through now, which compares the 40-shilling franchise, which was a form of electoral rights that Irish Catholics had acquired in the 1830s and then lost again thanks to O'Connell's kind of politicking to Frankenstein. And it's basically, these were people once filled with political life, and now the life has been taken away from them. They've become kind of undead or zombie-like. So the language, the image of the monster remains very kind of flexible. I'll conclude though not with these political references, which seem to pin down what is in many ways, as I think we've all been saying, the kind of very elusive and suggestive nature of Frankenstein's Irish scene, with some more kind of speculative or suggestive thoughts of my own. Another Irish novel of 1818, Charles Robert Maturin's novel Women. You might be familiar with Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer, one of the kind of great classics of European Romanticism. This is a Dublin set novel of 1820, in which one of the characters, talking about her mother, makes a kind of a reference to, and I quote, "that terrible sensation so common in the imaginations of the Irish, of a being whom we believe not to be alive, yet knowing not to be dead, who holds a kind of hovering intermediate existence between both worlds." And the character in the novel goes on to describe this kind of hovering intermediate existence. And she says, she's kind of almost doing an anthropology of this belief, and she says the mythology of all countries have something like this, and she includes Wordsworth's Lucy Gray in this. And she says, perhaps the cause of such wild imagery exists in the very nature of the human mind and its unknown relation to futurity. Maturin goes on, "We have never trod the confines of human existence with feet that felt the landmark." And it's on that quotation I want to come to an end. We have never tread the confines of human existence with feet that have felt the landmark. So a landmark is a boundary, the marker of an estate, often, drawing a line around where ownership starts or ends, but also this kind of looser idea of boundaries and borders. So when Mary Shelley sends her both the creature and Victor Frankenstein across what Britain's Brexiteers have taught to call as the border in the Irish Sea, she's doing something that combines both the kind of supernatural exploration and this kind of verifiable geography that points you towards landmark, feet that feel the landmark. John Wilson Croker went on to use Frankenstein as a kind of boundary marker that could hold a line against certain kinds of Irish Gothic writing. So reviewing Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer for the Quarterly, he said, "Compared with it, Lady Morgan is intelligible, the monk decent, the vampire amiable, Frankenstein natural." So it becomes a kind of boundary that you can cross. Frankenstein is, as we've been discussing at the conference, a sustained experiment in the possibility of a narrative voice that emerges from a place between life and death. And it's one that has clear resonances throughout 19th and 20th and into contemporary Irish writing. In his novel Testament of Mary, Count Tobin has the Virgin Mary tell the story of her son takes Lazarus away from the knowing and comforting realm of death. It's not always a successful novel, but it has remarkable scenes, Count Tobin's novel, in asking you to imagine actually what happens when Lazarus comes back to life. He's clothed in grave clothes, he's dirty with clay, he's only able to eat soft bread soaked in water. The Irish Frankenstein asks us, and with its kind of continuing legacies in literature, the question of what marginal, miserable, numerous, possibly criminal lives existing at a boundary between life and death mean as their feet tread real boundaries and possibly point to landmarks in our own time. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Connolly. We have a few minutes for questions. Sorry.
Oh yeah, I was looking for a microphone. I'll try to speak up. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you. That was a fantastic panel. I really appreciate every paper. Jim, I love the title of your talk, and I was really curious. When I read the title, I thought the way you would go with it was to look at that race of devils line as a kind of racial or ethnic slur and a religious slur against the Irish as a people incapable of controlling their own reproduction. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, because if that is potentially what it means, then, for at least from the English perspective, right, then the creature is an Irishman, probably Catholic, and incapable of controlling his own reproduction. So,
It's a fair question. I don't have a good answer. The bad answer is that, is this working? Yeah. The bad answer is that I was thinking of going in that direction when I gave the title some months ago. I couldn't find the evidence to make it work, and I thought my colleagues here would do a much better job with that kind of topic, and I was right about that too. So I just decided to go in a different direction. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to give it my best shot.
Please.
So we know Godwin didn't like Malthus, and so Godwin was deeply invested in the cause for Irish emancipation. Mary Shelley very well may have been using the kind of specter of the Irish people here. To engage this issue of the kind of racist implications and class-based implications of Malthusian population economics. Today, Marchesson has exploded, that those biases, right, and shown the ways in which that kind of thinking really is prejudicial towards peoples of other cultures, right, in the developing world. And so Ireland is basically the developing world of Europe, as as Claire's paper called out very beautifully with that passage about the poverty of the children there at the time. Maybe what Mary Shelley's doing, if the creature can be read as an Irishman or the Irish people, then maybe what she's doing is calling attention to this injustice of the way we look at them as a threat because of their supposed incapability of controlling their own reproduction.
Can I just respond to that? I think Jim mentioned the scene in The Last Man, which is a more appropriate kind of to the dynamic that you're trying to get at, which for those who haven't read the novel, there's a scene that can only be described as kind of an Irish zombie apocalypse in The Last Man, which is a really crazy scene, but it follows, there's this American invasion of Ireland first, and a diminishment of resources, and then this sick and dying population that floods into England. And it's a sequence of several pages. It's Mary Shelley's only other, by my investigation, sustained treatment of Ireland in any of her works. And I think it speaks more to this kind of, those anxieties that you're getting at.
I agree.
Thanks. Two quick related questions for Claire and Julie, although this also concerns Jim's comments about cosmopolitanism and about the villager scenario and so many of the adaptations. I love the points you were both making about how Victor's experience in Ireland in some ways connects him with the creature's experience through emaciation or through the judicial system. And what I was wondering is how you would go about explaining the initial reaction of the Irish villagers, which is so cruel and unthoughtful to Victor, as opposed to Kerwin's response. That question, quick question number one. And second, if Victor goes through this kind of process of some kind of a learning experience in Ireland, does he change at all afterwards?
For me, well, one thing is just simply it confounds expectations of Irish hospitality and so on, doesn't it? Which are well enough represented in print culture in that period to be there and overturned. So there's something recognizable happening. But the other thing I think is that it also belongs to, I think, a fairly recognizable body of scenes in British and Irish fiction of that period where people arrive in Ireland and don't realise it's Ireland, or they're talking to people. It happens in Owenson. It happens in Godwin, where people don't, where Ireland has to kind of come into view in some way, and it's estrangement from familiarity is part of a point that's being made. I think so. So that's so I think it's a kind of a kind of fictional, a recognizable fictional trope, I suppose. Yeah. I didn't take the second one.
Yeah. This gentleman here.
Yes, my name is Joe Wittrick, and before retirement, I taught at the Keough Graduate School. My question is for Jim Chandler. Jim, I didn't know until a couple of months ago about the Christopher Isherwood, Don Bacardi teleplay. And at the Huntington Library, I was going through the Isherwood papers, saw the book version, and read it. And what struck me immediately was the new subtitle, The True Story. And then I began thinking about, as I read through the book, about the kind of revisions they were making to Mary Shelley's version. And my sense that the best of adaptations, in the very revisions they make, often bring a higher truth from the story that's being told. And I wondered if you saw ways in which the Isherwood Bacardi teleplay was doing that with Mary Shelley. In any way provided new interpretive insight, let's say.
I'm so glad to know about this text because I'm going to spend a year at the Huntington, I think, in 2 years, and this gives me something else to do there besides what I was planning. I think there's a kind of Oscar Wildean irony in calling it the true story because it's so outrageous a set of recommendations. Although I think I wanted to ask Debbie if she actually had seen this one because I think in a certain way it's the one that's closest in spirit to what you're doing. It doesn't say Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is what a couple of the others do in that same period. And it's as if it were going, beyond Whale, beyond Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, to this backstory that was behind the story itself. It's one in which it's a good text for thinking about race, and if you are inclined to think that racial thematics are absolutely central to Mary Shelley's novel, it does seem to expose those. So it's a novel that makes quite intelligible the sort of history we were hearing yesterday about the Black Frankenstein, because it makes you think, oh yeah, this was always a novel about race. That's the true story about this novel. And there's something about its excess. The strange thing about the 2003 adaptation that I was calling Faithful is that it's in this kind of weirdly sort of Hollywood classical narrative system, shot, reverse shot, establishing shots, high production values. That is not the case with the film that's made from the Isherwood text. It's really over the top. It has totally outrageous things in it that sort with one half of Mary Shelley's novel. As we heard on, I think, the very first paper, the odd thing about Mary Shelley from Joyce Carol Oates, the odd thing about the novel is it's got this business-like way of going about its prose with these crazy events that are going on, drifting 500 miles in 2 days. And this gets at the really flamboyant side of it. So I'm dying to look at this text. I'm so glad you told me about it.
Okay, we have a question here.
I have a question for the panelists. Now I don't know if it's a question, some I don't know, general curiosities, and now I have two sources in my mind. One, of course, is Shelley, An Address to the Irish People, and also the other essay, where he seems to very busy in moralizing, so he busy moralizing, asking the Irish somehow to redeem, and to redeem from what? From the needs of the excessive body, no? In a way, too much sex, too much drink, too much labor. So that I find interesting. The other point, so I'm not very much surprised, is if on the other side, I mean on the conservative side, we have so many vignettes, so many cartoons on the, Frankenstein meant as a monstrous baby, which it goes along, even the working classes, Frankenstein, we have seen the black. Anyway, but let's go back to it. The other point is women. Women and within this Frankensteinization, I don't know if it's possible to say, of the Irish. Now, what about this incredible essay by Spencer, A View of the Present State of Ireland, where you do have a dialogue, no, between the Irish remain, the English remained in England, and the colonial somehow English who went to with in Ireland and comes back. And what they do is exactly the danger of miscegenation, of this coming to a intercourse with the local women, with the Irish women. And that is a point very clear around which Spencer keeps going on and on. No? So I find this strange coincidence.
Were Irish women safe with Frankenstein? Very quickly, because we've come to the end of our time.
It kind of goes back to what Greg was asking as well. So from the early modern period, there is a discourse of Ireland as wild and savage, and also welcoming and hospitable. And those are not different things. They belong they're forged in exactly the same early modern moment, and it's a stereotype. They're the flip side of each other. And that is well ingrained enough in print culture by the time Mary Shelley is writing Frankenstein to be utterly known and familiar, I think. So the things, they exist side by side. And there's also just the incredible question of population and populousness. So what is in 1822, the Irish population is 8 million. Scotland in the same period was 1 million. England was 4 or something like that. So, Irish population presented itself as a wonder to contemporary commentators, which is why so many political economists, why Godwin and so on, were drawn to the issue. So it's a kind of hugely a problem to be solved and discussed, and we forget about that often because the famine came so soon afterwards, changing the landscape entirely, and because something like this landscape, where Mary Shelley sends Frankenstein, is kind of in the shadow of the famine, if you like. We forget that. We think of these empty coastal places, but these were the most crowded places in this period.
Okay. Well, we have actually come to the end of our time, and and again, I saw a number of hands up, and I'm sure the panelists would be willing to stick around and answer any questions you have. But let us thank the panelists and thank the organizers.